Hello. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so glad to see you again. I'm Sarah at Penobscot Marine Museum, and let's jump right in. We have another painting from our collection today. This is the Pagoda Anchorage at Guangzhou. Westerners call it Canton. And you can see Western ships lined up by the hundreds, and a couple of small Chinese vessels there as well. Penobscot Bay families have, in the 19th century, went to China um, as sea captains, as ship's crew. And the trip took a long time. It took 3 years sometimes, 3 years away from family, friends, wives, children. And we've got one guy who is from Boston, Robert Bennet Forbes. He was in Guangzhou or Canton at the same time as this painting was made. Robert Bennet Forbes was both a ship captain and a China trade merchant. And he had traveled to Guangzhou in 1838. He left at home his wife with a little 7-month-old baby, a baby boy he called Bob. And Robert Bennet Forbes, this guy right here, he felt homesick and he missed his wife. And so he wrote home to his wife daily in journal style letters. And this gives us historians a terrific glimpse into what life was like at this time and place that this painting was made. Guangzhou, or Canton, is on the Pearl River, and the Pearl River goes out into this strait, which the Westerners called the Bogue, which is an Anglicization of a Portuguese name, the Boca Tigris. Guangzhou has been an important port for thousands of years, going as far back as 200 BCE. Because China, of course, has its own very long maritime history. The world has wanted to buy Chinese goods for thousands of years, including Romans importing silks along the Silk Road. And during the Song dynasty, which lasted from the year 960 to the year 1275, Chinese maritime trade flourished. Song dynasty merchants sailed all over to Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, the east coast of Africa. And archaeologists have found Song ships wrecked at the bottom of the ocean with cargoes full of tens of thousands of ceramics, spices, coins, bamboo products. Compasses, too, are first mentioned by the Chinese in the year 1119. Portuguese ships went to China as early as 1513, wanting to trade, but they were rebuffed multiple times by the Chinese government. But after repeated applications in 1559, the Portuguese were finally allowed to settle at Macau. This island, it was an island at that time. Later it was filled in to become a little peninsula. You can also see Hong Kong over here, which has been in the news quite a bit today. these recent days, and Canton is way up, about 60 miles up from Macau. And there's a lot of ports like this. It's a very protected situation. It means pirates can't just come and bombard your town from the sea quickly and easily. If your town is way far in up this windy river, then you're more able to protect yourself.
I just want to hop in and say welcome to everybody that's watching live. Thanks for joining us with the Penobscot Marine Museum. And just a reminder, if you have any questions throughout the talk, go ahead and write them in the comments section, and Sarah will try her best to answer.
Thank you. Yes, we want to hear from you. So I appreciate you remembering to say that thing that I forgot to say. So we can see that windy river and this island. We saw that group of islands in the map, and we see that here in the center. There was a western burying ground, and this is the anchorage, the pagoda anchorage, where ships were allowed to stay. The Chinese were very cautious about letting foreigners into the country. Canton was the only place that Westerners were allowed to trade. By the 18th century, although silk, of course, was still highly desired, tea was the most wanted product, especially from Britain. Extensive systems were put into place to protect the China and the Canton locals from the foreign devils, or so the Chinese sometimes called Westerners. Ships were checked in at Macau, and then they had to allow a Chinese official to measure the whole cargo. And of course, it was also customary to give this official a gift as well. And then the ships went up that long, windy river that we saw on the map to here, the pagoda anchorage. And we can see the flags of the ship. These are British ships right here. This is French ship, an American ship. The ship and crew were required to stay here. They had to stay out here. They were not allowed to come into Canton. So the everyday people, workers on the ship, were stuck there sometimes for months. And it was just the captain and the business manager, the business representative, who were allowed to come into Canton. And they were only allowed to stay in this area, the Hong area. So a Hong is one of these, they were called factories back then, but they weren't manufacturing things. It was just basically an office building. So the bottom, the first floor of each of these buildings was a large warehouse. And then the second and third floors held offices and residence for all of these Westerners coming in to do business. And they were trying to fit this into a good season between the monsoons, because when it's raining hard is not a great time to be carrying cargo around. So let's get this, another painting from our collection. These are the Hongs, these white faces of buildings that you see here. And you can see each one has a flagpole. And so this is the American Hong, this is the French Hong, the British Hong, and all kinds of ships out in front along the river. A steamship here with a big wheel, a Chinese vessel that's highly decorated here. Maybe it was a flower boat. There's boats with coverings, different kinds of sails. Smaller boats, Chinese boats, were used to carry the cargo from the ships into the city, into Guangzhou. So one example of these Chinese boats that were used is a sampan, which is what we're looking at right here. This is the crew of a sampan, a family who probably both lived and worked on the boat. And sampans were hired for a number of different things. They carried cargo and they helped with a lot of other tasks as well, such as ferrying the captain back and forth, ferrying the business merchant back and forth. Thanks again for joining us at Penobscot Marine Museum. We're looking at some paintings from our collections, and this is the pagoda anchorage at Guangzhou. We can see the amazing Asian landscape with those high peaks and all of the ships out in the harbor. Navigating all of the bureaucracy, finding someone to buy the cargo at a good price, finding the desired cargo to buy and bring back home. All of this took a very long time. And so the China traders like Forbes were living in Guangzhou, Canton for months. Americans and British, having a common language, hung out together. That's something that Florence Pendleton of Searsport describes. So Searsport's right where our museum is. She's there a little bit later in the 19th century, but describes similar things to Forbes. She traveled to China with her husband. She did some sightseeing and did a lot of shopping. She hired a young Arab boy to help her carry things. She had tiffin, which is like lunch, and she had tea with other captains' wives. And she was doing a lot of shopping because apparently she needed clothes. She also wasn't feeling very well, but she's Victorian, so she didn't tell us why, but I bet you can guess why she might both not be feeling well and also need a whole new set of clothes. Forbes also describes elaborate parties and dinners, both with Chinese and Western wealthy merchants. He describes an amazing dinner at one Chinese merchant's home. They had tea of different kinds. They had black chopsticks with silver ends. The table was strewn with fresh scented flowers. There was some 20 courses with different meats and vegetables and a bowl of rice. And this meal started and ended with both fresh and candied fruits. Another glimpse that Forbes gives us into Chinese culture at this time is he complains of the incessant firecrackers at Chinese New Year. In an effort to keep Westerners in check, rules were outlined for regulating foreigners' behavior. Some of the rules included warships were prohibited in the strait. You can see why they would want that. Neither guns, spears, nor arms of any kind were permitted in the trading houses. Smuggling was prohibited. Westerners were kept in the trading houses and only allowed to visit the flower gardens on a few specific days of the month. No rowing about for pleasure. At one point, they wanted to have a regatta and they appealed to the officials to have a regatta on the river, and the officials very politely wrote back saying, there are many boats along the river and there would be accidents. So no, you can't do that. The Westerners had to stay and work in the trading houses and not go far. And also they were only allowed to trade at Guangzhou. They were not allowed to go to any other Chinese port. Guangzhou was towards the south, farther away from Beijing and the capital, considered the more important piece of China. And also the Westerners were only allowed to trade with specific authorized merchants. So as you can imagine, some of these merchants became very wealthy. This is Howqua. He was one of these merchants, and in fact, he was the leader of this whole group of Chinese merchants that the Westerners were allowed to trade with. Howqua, even after, well after these strictures were relaxed, he was the one that New Englanders trusted. They write about his honesty and integrity. And so once they knew him and gotten to know him and knew that he was honest, they didn't want to work with anybody else. Howqua is his business name. His personal name was Wu Bingjiang. He is estimated by historians to be the wealthiest person in the world in the first part of the 19th century. He created beautiful large gardens for his visitors' pleasure, but Forbes says most of the time he was very frugal. And so I've got another cool image of the Hongs.
Sarah, can I interrupt
Yes.
really quick? I want to give a shout out to Terry, who says this is fascinating. Thanks for joining us, Terry, and the rest of you that are joining us live. And if you do have any questions or comments, please just post them in the comments section.
Yes, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks for joining us. So we can see again those white buildings, these big buildings that go back away from the Pearl River in these long rectangles. And right in front here is the Protestant church. And you can see gardens as well in front, a bunch of trees and places to walk around and get fresh air. We can see the British Hong, which was large, large and elaborate. Forbes's friend, William C. Hunter, also talks about working and trading in Canton, and it talks about how the British Hong is the biggest and fanciest, and that they have a billiards room and a huge dining room and all kinds of fancy things. French, American, Prussian. Some of these European hongs were not actually used that much by the country themselves, and so Forbes talks about trying to rent room in the Swedish hong and some different things like that. There's some very cool boats being shown out front here. You can see a couple of British boats, and so the ships in the anchorage had like the British flag on a red background. These have the British flag on a white background, and both of those were used at the same time. They were ship ensigns, so they were used on ships. And more decorative Chinese vessels, and looks like little sampans, just like the one we saw the photograph of. So these are all businessmen, all of these Westerners who were in Canton, and time is money. And the time it took to navigate all of the bureaucracy and the time it took for the small Chinese boats to take the cargo back and forth, it's subtracted from the profits. And the British were incensed by the restrictions of the Canton system. And they sent an emissary in 1793 to meet with the emperor to push for trade. This is Emperor Qianlong right here. Emperor Qianlong said, "You have nothing that we want." The British really wanted tea, but they didn't have any product that the Chinese wanted. China is a vast country, and it's got all different climates, and so they can grow rice and tea and all of the different things that their citizens want. So the British returned empty-handed. And what they ended up doing over time was they increased production of opium in India and sold more and more of the addictive drug to the Chinese, despite laws against it that went back to 1729. Forbes himself had also made a fortune in earlier years with other New Englanders who had cornered the Turkish opium market. And sold all of it in China. This time around in 1838, Forbes says he's very relieved to no longer be in the opium trade. He says the opium trade, which has been demoralizing the minds, destroying the bodies, and draining the country of money. The Chinese government tried multiple times and once again to crack down on the importation of the drug. They begged the British to stop importing it. They confiscated and destroyed a large supply in 1839 when Forbes was there. Instead of the British ceasing importing the drug as the Chinese requested, instead, the British brought gunboats. Forbes, working in Canton during this conflict, describes the poor and hungry Chinese people gathering in mobs, trying to attack the trading houses, aware that all of the opium had been brought in by foreign traders. And there's probably all these other dynamics too. The Cantonese people are being, ruled by the Mandarins who are from farther north in China. The people are poor, and these both Western and Chinese merchants are extremely wealthy, having all these fancy parties with fancy food. But the British, with their gunboats, defeated the Chinese quickly in 1841 and 42 with superior gun power. And the Treaty of Nanking was signed in 1843, which both ceded Hong Kong to Britain and also involved a very large cash payment from the Chinese to the British. So that's how all that conflict ended. There's so many factors that went into this whole conflict, and of course we've only just scratched the surface here in our 20 minutes. But thank you so much for joining us here today. We love hearing from you. Please ask us questions, post them below. We are very grateful for our members, our donors. You are supporting us, and we're so glad. This program was brought to you in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Human Endeavor. Thank you once again for joining us. I love talking to you about history, and I really appreciate you joining me here today. Join us again next week, Friday at noon, for another painting from our collections that we'll look closely at. Thank you and take care.